History remembers Jesus. That sounds completely normal to us, almost too normal. His name is everywhere. People build churches in his honor. Entire societies have been shaped by ideas connected to him. Even people who aren't religious usually know something about Jesus. But here's what's strange. If you had been living in Judea when all of this started, there would have been no obvious reason to think his story would outlast everyone else's. That's the part people rarely stop to think about. Jesus appeared in a place that was already full of expectation. People were frustrated. People were waiting. Many believed God was about to do something significant. And whenever a society reaches that point, unusual figures begin to attract attention. A man gains a following. People start talking. Rumors spread. For a while, it feels like something important might be happening. Then the excitement fades and life moves on. History is filled with stories like that. Most of them are forgotten. So why is Jesus different? Because if we're being honest, his story doesn't look like the beginning of a world-changing movement. It looks like the end of one. His ministry lasts only a few years. He clashes with powerful groups. Eventually, he ends up on a Roman cross. From the perspective of almost everyone watching, that's where the story should stop. Imagine hearing about it at the time. A teacher gains attention. Authorities step in. He's executed. Case closed. That outcome wasn't unusual. What happened next was. The people closest to Jesus didn't behave the way defeated followers normally behave. Something had changed. There was no sudden military victory. Rome was still there. The followers of Jesus didn't suddenly gain wealth, influence, or political power. If anything, their situation became more dangerous. Yet the fear that followed the crucifixion gradually gave way to conviction. And that's where the mystery deepens. The same people who had watched Jesus die began telling others that his story wasn't over. They became convinced that he had risen from the dead. People still debate that claim today. They probably always will. But regardless of where someone stands on it, a historical question remains. Why did these people become so convinced that the story continued after the crucifixion? Whatever answer a person gives, that question doesn't disappear, and it leads to another one, a surprisingly overlooked one. Why didn't Jesus write anything himself? Think about that for a moment. The central figure of the world's largest religion never sat down and wrote a book. There is no letter signed by Jesus, no personal account, no document that historians can point to and say with confidence, these words were written directly by him. At first, that sounds almost impossible. How does a movement become this influential without that? Part of the answer is that Christianity didn't begin as a religion centered around a text. It began as a movement centered around testimony. People weren't following a manuscript, they were following witnesses. The message spread through conversations long before it spread through pages. Stories were repeated, teachings were remembered. Communities formed around what people believed they had seen and heard. Only later were those memories written down and gathered into the documents that would become the New Testament. In other words, the movement came first, the writings came later. And that's one of the most unusual things about Christianity. The faith that would eventually become associated with one of the most influential books in history did not begin with a book at all. It began with people. People who became convinced that something extraordinary had happened. People who refused to let the story end at the cross. That's why we're still talking about Jesus. It's not because he left behind a manuscript. What survived was something far more difficult to explain. A small group of ordinary people became convinced that history had changed. That conviction spread from person to person, then from city to city, and eventually far beyond Judea. 2,000 years later, The movement they helped build has reached almost every corner of the world. Whether someone sees that as faith, truth, mystery, or something else entirely is a separate conversation. What's difficult to deny is the outcome. The man who never wrote a book became the central figure of the most influential movement in human history. History remembers Jesus, and the more you think about it, the stranger that fact becomes.